All right, so to get started here, let's talk about the basic strategy that we're going to be using to clean up our code. And just to show you what code we're going to be cleaning up, let's open up our server.js file here and take a look at our io.use and io.on code, right? This stuff is getting pretty large and pretty complex. And currently, there's not really a good way for us to move this out of the server.js file. So what we're going to be taking a look at here is a way to basically represent all of the logic that we have here with our current IO using a pattern which is going to be kind of similar to what we did with Express. So let me just show you what I mean by that. If we go down to where we define all of our Express routes, we see, remember that this is kind of the format that we used in order to define all of the routes for our server and make it so that they were easy to split off into separate files, right? So in other words, our server file only has about 3 or 4 lines here that are actually devoted to adding the routes to the server, and everything else is defined in its own file and exported in, in the correct pattern. So what we're going to be doing here is rewriting our socket code to look a little bit more like what we did with Express. Now, just to show you what this is going to look like here, I'm just going to come up with a basic structure and we'll draw it out. Now, this is just one possible structure. There are probably many other ones that would work as well. So if you come up with a better idea, feel free to try that out as well. All right, so essentially what we're going to do here, and this is going to make a lot more sense once we actually start implementing different scenarios with our WebSockets, such as, keeping the notes on a user's notes list page in sync with notes that are shared with them, etc. You'll see what that looks like later on. But basically what we're going to do is we're going to split our WebSocket behavior into different situations, right? Or scenarios, or maybe we just want to call them connection types or something like that. And basically, within each of these connection types, which again represent a situation that our application is using WebSockets to handle, such as on our note detail page, where we're using that to actually keep notes, title, and description in sync across various users' browsers. Basically, the way that we're going to define each of these is, again, similar to what we did with Express. We're going to define them declaratively. So each of our different socket types or connection types or situations, whatever you want to call it, is going to have several properties. The first one we're going to call name, and this is going to be the name of the type of connection that we're talking about, right? So in the case of our note detail situation, we might want to call this something like single note, right? Because this socket is handling the situation where we're trying to keep a single notes data in sync across several browsers. Again, if any of this stuff sounds a little complicated, don't worry too much about it now. You'll see it all in action shortly. But anyway, so each of these configuration objects is going to have a name that we'll use to refer to that situation. It's also going to have an array of event handlers. Okay, so each of these event handlers, we'll go into more depth on that, but basically each of these event handlers is going to define the logic that will happen, right? The logic that will be executed whenever a given event occurs, right? Whenever a user updates a note, let's say, or deletes a note, or shares a note with another user, and so on. That's what these event handler things are going to deal with. And we'll talk about how those are defined in a little more detail later on. But additionally, each of these objects is also going to have a middleware property, and this might remind you of what we did with our Express app. Basically, the middleware here is going to define the necessary criteria for a user on the front end to connect and participate in this socket situation, right? So again, if we're talking about a single note, then the middleware here would include things like checking to make sure that the user is logged in, checking to make sure that the user has access to the note, and so on and so forth, right? Now, this is actually going to be itself an array of functions, which we'll see how to define those later on. It's going to be very similar to what we saw with Express, and that'll actually be a good opportunity to draw some interesting parallels between sockets and just regular server routes. So this is going to be the main structure and the main, configuration object that we're going to use to define the different situations in our app. And currently, the only situation is when we're dealing with a single note from the note detail page. So just keep that in mind, but we will be adding more situations later on, as I said. So this will just set us up for success in the future. All right, so now that we've decided on that, let's talk a little bit more about how our event handlers are going to be defined here. Basically, our event handlers are going to take into account two main things, right? What is the action that we're responding to, and how do we respond to it? So again, remember that when we've defined different action handlers on our server so far, we basically just say socket.on, and we just call this as a function. The first argument is the name of the event that we want to listen for, right? So update note was just an example here. And the second argument is a function that will be called whenever this action occurs, right? And that will contain all of the logic that we want to execute whenever this action happens. So what we're going to need to do then, and here, let me just draw this function here so you get the idea. What we're going to need to do is, just like how with express, we were able to transform something like this, right, by saying app.get, and then we had the path like this, and then we had the callback, which was just a function like that. Just like we were able to do that in Express and transform this into a configuration object that had, method get, might be something like that. And then path, of course, would be /notes. And then we would, of course, have the handler function. So just like we were able to do that with Express, we're going to do the same thing with our socket logic, and we're going to sort of separate those into objects depending on the different types of event. So what this is going to end up looking like here is we're going to have an object that will have a property called something like event name. We might be able to just call this name if you want. And that's going to be the type of event, or the string of the event that we're responding to. So again, that might be update note in this case. And then we're also going to have a handler function, which will contain all of the logic that we want to execute when this event actually happens. Now, in addition to these two things, we're also going to want to have an action-specific middleware array. All right, so I'm just going to say middleware here. And this is going to contain logic that will protect our data in our server from unwanted manipulation, right? Basically, this is where we're going to say whether or not a given user is allowed to emit some kind of event in our server. So again, a user might be able to log onto the note detail page and see the note, but then when they go and try and update it, we're going to want to stop them from doing that. And that's essentially what the middleware here is going to be for. So anyway, what this does is it gives us a basic structure, right, a data structure of sorts for dealing with WebSockets in an Express server, right? This is how we're going to represent our WebSockets, and that'll allow us to split our WebSocket logic out into separate files. Now, this is a little busy, I apologize, but hopefully this all makes sense. If not, you'll see what it looks like when we actually code this out. So anyway, that's going to be our basic approach. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.